Welcome to my channel. Have you ever had a moment that stopped your world completely? Not in grief, not in anger, but in a silence so deep I echoed with something you never expected to hear. Before I tell you what my son said, he went to ask, where are you watching this from? Which city? Tell me in comments. I love seeing just how many of us are quietly connected by life's strangest, most beautiful turns. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. The house had grown painfully quiet since my husband Harold passed. After 42 years of marriage, his absence wasn't just in the space next to me in bed. It echoed through the kitchen, the garage, even the creaky hallway. Everywhere I looked, something reminded me of him. His toothbrush, the wool cardigan Hellway's left hanging on the back of the evening room chair, the half-finished crossword puzzle. On the porch table, the days blurred together. I kept busy the way most widows probably do, cleaning drawers that didn't need it, folding laundry wasn't dirty, rearranging tapestry just for the sake of doing something with my hands. But grief doesn't get organized away. It lingers. My son Stanley had been so attentive through it all. He visited every few days. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes just himself. He was 42 now, strong like his father had been, with the same warm hazel eyes and thoughtful senses. Since his own divorce 2 years ago, he'd become more inward, like he was constantly processing the world instead of reacting to it. One Thursday afternoon, I had just come in from watering the plants when I heard his key in the lock. I turned and smiled instinctively, my heart always a little lighter when I saw him. "You're early," I said, brushing my hands on a towel. He smiled, but there was something behind his eyes. "Oh, wait." He hugged me gently, not rushed. He held in longer than usual. "I thought you might want some company today," he said softly. I didn't ask why today or all days. Truth was, I did want company, but something told me he wasn't here just to check on me. We sat in the kitchen for a while, sipping coffee. The breeze blew in through the open window above the sink, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Outside, someone's dog barked lazily. Life, it seemed, kept moving even when I felt like I'd been standing still for months. He leaned on the table, hands wrapped around his cup, his knuckles tense. I knew that look. It was the Simeon he had as a boy when he was working up the courage to ask me something, like when he broke in the neighbor's window with a baseball, or when he wanted to stay out past curfew. I waited. Mom. He finally said, not looking at me. Do you ever feel like you lost more than just Dad? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? He hesitated. I mean, did losing him make you feel like part of you disappeared too? I felt my breath catch. I looked down at me hands, wrinkled, veined, a little shaky these days. Yes, I said. That's exactly how it feels. There was a long pause. Stanley stood, walked slowly to the window, then turned around and leaned against the counter. I think I lost a part of myself when you did too. I'd looked at him confused. He continued. You were different with Dad around. Always on your toes, always smiling, but guarded. I felt it. Even as a kid, I always wanted to be closer to you, but there was this wall, invisible but real. I blinked. My throat was tight. Stanley. He held up his hand gently. I'm not saying not to hurt you. I guess you've been thinking about it a lot since Dad's funeral. I feel like I see you, the real you, and I want to know that person, not just as my mother, as you. His words both stunned and warmed me. He wasn't sure how to respond. He pulled out a small wooden box from his coat pocket. I found this when I was going through Dad's things. I took it gently. It was smooth and worn. Inside was a photograph I had forgotten even existed. A black and white shot of me, maybe in my 20s, laughing barefoot in the garden with a straw hat and a sunburst. I smiled at it, but also felt a deep pang of sadness. I barely recognize her, I said, brushing my thumb across the image. But I do, Stanley replied, and I want to bring her back. I want you back, Mom. His voice trembled slightly. I looked up and saw his eyes were misted. I reached for his hand and held it tight. There was something powerful in that silence between us, decades of unspoken things, of assumed roles and unacknowledged desires for closeness. He finally whispered something I didn't expect. Can I ask you something personal? I looked into his eyes, heart beating a little faster out of course. His voice was barely above a whisper. Would it be okay if we talked more about things we never did before? Not his mother and son, just two people trying to make sense of the years well lost. There. It was, not inappropriate, not uncomfortable, but deeply honest. He wasn't asking for anything physical. Nothing shameful, just something more profound. Something that cracked open the rigid structure of who we were supposed to be, and offered a bridge between hearts that had drifted quietly apart. I nodded. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel quite so alone-y. The hours after Stanley's visit lingered in my mind like the scent of his aftershave in the hallway. Faint but unforgettable. I sat on the porch that evening watching the sun dip below the neighbor's maple tree, my fingers still tracing the edges of that old photograph he had given me. The woman that's so carefree, so full of life. It was strange to think that she was me once. That version of Lisa had felt like a distant memory, almost like another person entirely. Someone I admired, but didn't fully remember how to be. Stanley's. Words had struck a chord deeper than I wanted to admit. Not just because they came from him, but because they felt like something I'd been longing to hear without knowing it. It wasn't often that someone asked how I was. Not just as a grieving widow or a mother or Somyeon's neighbor, but as a woman, a person with her own faded dreams and silenced thoughts. The next few days passed quietly. Stanley didn't call, but he wasn't upset. Something told me he was giving me space to think, and I needed it that then. On Sunday afternoon, I heard that familiar knock. 2 short taps and a pause, just like he used to do when he was a boy. I opened the door and there stood, a bag of groceries in one hand, a 6-pack of root beer in the other. I brought lunch, he said with a smile that felt different this time, softer, less guarded. I let him in, and we settled into the kitchen. I made his sandwiches while he sliced some apples, and soon we were sitting together, knees nearly touching under the table. You look lighter, he said after a few minutes of quiet eating. I laughed gently. Maybe it's the mayonnaise. He smirked, then shook his head. No, I'm in it. You seem more you. I looked down, brushing a crumb off my lap. I've been thinking about what you said about us. His eyes met mine, and I took a slow breath. You were right. I did put a wall up, not just with you, with everyone. Your father was a good man, but there were parts of me I had to keep quiet around him. Not because he was cruel, but because, well, because a marriage sometimes becomes more about peace than honesty. And I guess I got us to not being fully seen. Stanley listened quietly, his expression unreal, but his eyes held a tenderness I hadn't seen in him since he was a child. I want to know you too, I said. Not just as my son, but as Stanley, the man you've become. He blinked, visibly moved. There was a long silence between us, the kind that isn't awkward, but tricked with meaning. And then softly he reached across the table and touched my hand. His fingers were warm, familiar. Do you ever wonder, he asked, quietly, what it would have been like if we'd grown up differently, if you hadn't had to be so distant? I looked at him, unsure how to answer. Yes, I said finally, more times than I can count. The air between us thickened, not with tension, not exactly, but with possibility. We were standing on unfamiliar ground, but neither of us seemed ready to step back. Later, that evening, after dishes were done and the sun began to fade, Stanley offered to stay and watch a movie, something we hadn't done in years. We settled on an old classic, To Kill a Mockingbird, and sat side by side on the couch. At first, we stayed apart, but over time, without thinking, I rested my head lightly on his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He didn't move away. Instead, he gently rested, his cheek against the top of my hair. I could hear his heartbeat, and it was calm, steady, comforting. A thought crossed my mind then, one I never imagined I'd allow myself to feel. I felt safe, not just physically. Emotionally, that rare deep safety that only comes when someone sees you, really sees you, and still chooses to stay close. When the movie ended, we sat there for a moment in the quiet. I miss this, Hess said. Me too, I whispered. He didn't leave right away. He stayed until the moon was high in the sky. When he finally rose to go, he turned to meet the door and looked into my eyes for what felt like a full minute. Can I ask you something else? He said. I nodded. If I came over more often, not just to help around the house, but just to be with you, would that be okay? There was no hesitation in me this time. Yes, I said, my voice warm, and as he leaned forward to kiss my cheek goodbye. His lips lingered for a fraction of a second longer than usual. It wasn't dramatic. It was in single quotes, to an appropriate. It was tender. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the entryway for a long time. Something had shifted between us, and deep down I knew this was just the beginning. The week that followed was filled with thoughts I couldn't quite entangle. I'd find myself standing in front of the sink, water running over dishes I'd already washed, or folding laundry that didn't belong to anyone anymore. My mind wasn't on chores. It was with Stanley. Not in a dramatic or inappropriate way, just quietly there in the corner of my thoughts, in the space where silence eyes to hurt. I started catching myself smiling at nothing, remembering the way his hand had felt in mine, the way he had looked at me, like I was someone worth knowing. Gaggin. He came back on Tuesday. No groceries this time. No excuse. I was in the neighborhood, he said, but Wolf knew he wasn't. We didn't do anything special that day. We sat on the porch and watched the wind move through the trees, drank sweet tea, and talked about music, about his childhood, about all the little things we had forgotten to share over the years. He told me things I'd never known, about how lonely had felt as a teenager, how his father's quiet strength had also made him feel like he had to be strong, too, even when he didn't want to be. How sometimes he'd sit in the garage and listen to me humming in the kitchen and wonder what kind of woman I really was underneath all the layers of motherhood. I listened, really listened, and something inside me began to soften in a way I hadn't allowed in decades. I told him things too, about the first time I ever fell in love long before his father, about how I once wanted to be a painter, about how I used to write poetry but stopped because Harold didn't think much of it. Stanley didn't say anything for a moment after that. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a slim notebook. I've been writing too, he said, a little shy. It started during the divorce. Just Hot's feelings. He handed it to me. I opened it and read a few lines. They were raw, honest, and full of heart. You're good, I said, surprised by how deeply his words touched me. Really good. He smiled, that same boyish smile I hadn't seen since he was 16. That night, he stayed for dinner. We cooked together, something we hadn't in years. He chopped vegetables while I stirred sauce, and we moved around each other in the kitchen like dancers in an old routine. At one point, our hands brushed as we both reached for the same spoon, and we paused, just for a second. But in that second, everything in Theron felt louder. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the breath caught in my chest. Neither of us spoke, but neither of us looked away either. After dinner, we sat on the couch again. No movie this time, just music, a soft jazz record I hadn't played in years. Helen back, arm resting across the top of the sofa, and I leaned in, Miss Holder against his chest. It felt natural, like we had done it 1,000 times before, even though we hadn't dot. Do you remember when I broke my arm? Suddenly, of course. I do, I laughed. You fell out off the sycamore tree trying to impress the neighbor girl. She never even noticed. He chuckled, but you sat with me all night. You didn't sleep. You just kept stroking my hair and whispering that everything will be all right. My smile faded into something more emotional. I remember. You were in so much pain. I wasn't, he said softly. Not really. Not after you helped me like that. We were quiet. Again. But this time Eth's silence was thick with memories and unspoken feelings. He turned toward me then, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. It was a gesture so delicate, so filled with care that my heart nearly stopped. His eyes searched mine, not hungrily, not inappropriately, but earnestly, like he was asking for something without saying a word, and I found myself answering not with speech, but with presence, with openness, with the way I didn't pull back. He didn't kiss me. That would have been too much too soon. But he did something that felt even more intimate. He rested his forehead against mine, and was stayed that way for a long time. No words, just breath, just closeness, just the quiet recognition that something inside both of us had shifted. When he finally stood to leave, he looked unsure like he didn't want to go, but also didn't want to push. I don't know what this is, he said, his voice a little shaky. Neither do I whispered. But doesn't feel wrong. He nodded slowly. It feels like something we were both missing. That night, after he left, I sat in the dim light of the living room, my hands in my lap, staring at nothing, and I realized I didn't feel ashamed. I felt seen, heard, held in a way I hadn't been in decades. Something had begun to bloom, and whatever. I wasn't afraid of it. Not anymore. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the empty way they had been after Harold passed. It was a different kind of quiet now. Gentle, thoughtful, alive. The silence in the house no longer echoed with absence. It felt full, like it was holding something carefully between breaths. I kept busy with little things, reorganizing the closet, dusting shelves that hadn't seen a cloth in months. Booty wasn't doing it to distract myself anymore. I was preparing, making space inside and out. For what? I wasn't really sure. But I could feel something shifting, like a season changing just before the first leaf falls. Stanley didn't come the next day or the day after that. And strangely, that didn't bother me because I knew he would come. And when he did, it wouldn't out of obligation or habit. It would because he wanted to. On Saturday evening, just as the sun was dipping low and the sky had turned soft orange and lavender, I heard the knock. Sammer Hibbam, 2 short taps, 1. Pause. I opened the door and there he was. No backpack, no groceries, just him. Hi, I said a little nervously. Can I come in? You don't have to ask. He smiled and something in his shoulders relaxed. I stepped aside and he entered like it was his first time all over again. I led him to the living room, the same room we'd sat in so many times, but night it felt different. The air between us carried something fragile, electric. We didn't sit apart. We sat close, our thighs brushing on the couch, our shoulders touching. He reached for my hand and I let him take it. His thumb traced slow circles against my skin. I've been thinking, he said quietly, about us, about what we're doing, what we're feeling. I nodded, her thooting gently in my chest. Me too. It scares me, he admitted, because it's not something people would understand. I met this gaze. Do you understand it? I paused. I don't know, but I feel it, and it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like healing. That word struck me in a place I didn't even know was still hurting. Healing. Yes. That's what this was, not a fantasy. Not confusion. It was something tender that had grown from years of unspoken love, from the cracks left behind by loss. It was born from lust, but from the longing to have known fully, deeply, without shame. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Hesed, squeezing my hand gently. If this ever crosses a line, you haven't, I said quickly. Stanley, you've been more gentle with my heart than anyone in my life. He exhaled, that same quiet relief I'd seen in him as a child when a truth finally slipped free. We talked for hours that night about life, about regrets, about choices we never made, Butte always wondered about. He told me hadn't felt truly close to anyone since his divorce, that he hadn't even let Simeon hold his hand in over a year. That sitting next to me felt safer than any relationship he'd known as an adult. I told him things I'd never say out loud before, about the ache of growing older, the loneliness of being seen on withdrawal, the lens of roles. Wife, mother, widow, and never just as Lisa. When the clock struck midnight, he stood up slowly. I should go, he said, but I don't want to. I stood with him. We were face-to-face, the room dim and warm. You can't stay, I said before I could second-guess myself. Just asleep, just hope here. He looked at me, searching for something in my eyes. I'll stay on the couch, he offered as if testing the space. You don't have to, I said, my voice quiet. We've already crossed the bridge. We're just walking slowly now. I turned off the lights and held him to my room. We didn't rush. Wouldn't even undress. We lay in bed, fully clothed, facing each other in the soft dark. Our fingers tangled, our breaths synchronized, and in that bed there was no guilt, no taboo. Just a mother and her grown son rediscovering one another in a way neither of us had ever planned, not with bodies, but with open hearts. He kissed me forehead, then my cheek, and then very gently my lips. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of knowing, of gratitude, of reverence. He pulled back, his eyes shining in the moonlight. I love you, he whispered, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid to say it back. I love you, too. That night, we slept wrapped in each other's arms like two souls who had finally returned home, not because we had broken something, but because we had finally started to repair what had long been fractured. The next morning, he made me tea, kissed me hand at the table, promised to be back for dinner, and I stood by the window as he left, a quiet smile on my lips, the sun warming my skin. For the first time since Harold's death, maybe even longer than that, I felt whole again, not because I had filled the space he left, but because Stanley and I had created something new from what was left behind, and it was